So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today, Joel Brammeier. He's the president and CEO of the Alliance of the Great Lakes. It's a nonprofit agency that works to protect the Great Lakes through advocacy, volunteering, education, and research. He oversees all aspects of the organization, leads a team of professionals across 5 locations. He's become a voice for invasive species and testified before Congress, but that was fun, on invasive species solutions. He's also active as an advisor for the U.S. governors and Canadian premiers on the Great Lakes Compact. So with that, let's welcome Joel.
Thanks, Greg. Can folks hear me without the mic, or should I use it? All right, I knew that was what was going to happen. So I'm going to try to move through my presentation relatively efficiently. So your next presenter, who's sitting right here, Val Clump, has plenty of time to go over his stuff too. I'm Joel Brammeier. First of all, thank you to the Community Foundation and to Annie Egan for inviting me to do this, and also to Greg and to Carmen for their work setting up the event. This is really fantastic, so I'm glad to be here. So my name's Joel Brammeier. I run an organization called the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Today I want to talk with you about 3 things. I want to talk a little bit about what makes this part of the world special and unique, in my opinion, and I think probably in many of yours. I'm going to give you that perspective from the broad Great Lakes standpoint, knowing that you're going to talk a lot about Door County, and you know this place better than I do. Talk a little bit about some of the problems that are facing the Great Lakes, and then what you can do to get involved in helping to fix that. And so before we do any of that, I got a confession. This is actually a picture from Michigan. I'm sorry. So I grew up in Michigan, and this is not Wisconsin, but I know that everybody here probably from where you left this morning, you probably left a place that is very special to you. And what makes that connection to the Great Lakes and to clean water unique to this part of the world is what I'm going to talk about today. And it's the reason that I'm in this work. I've been doing Great Lakes protection work for 20 years. And our vision is a healthy Great Lakes for all people and wildlife forever. It's pretty straightforward. As an organization, we have more than 50,000 volunteers, advocates, and donors around the Great Lakes region. And we are a 4-star charity navigator organization for 8 years running. And you can find out more about that at greatlakes.org. And the work that we do really puts a premium on helping people understand some of the big challenges that are facing the Great Lakes, and then giving people opportunities to get involved in actually being part of fixing those. And because what makes the region special, we heard from Greg this morning, about the concern that sometimes water issues can be divisive, and I think that as you get more and more local, that becomes more and more true. We want to make water a unifier. I know from talking to people all over the Great Lakes region that regardless of where you come from, we do share a value for clean water in the Great Lakes. And I think there's a great deal of potential in bridging some of the divides we have by focusing on the goal of safe and clean water, which is something that I have yet to encounter someone who doesn't agree that everybody should have safe and clean water. Okay, so before we talk about some of the challenges that the region is facing, I just want to give a few examples of what makes this place so astounding. You've all seen maps like this before with all the watersheds of the different Great Lakes. The thing I like to point out is that from Duluth, Minnesota to Montreal, Quebec is actually more than 1,000 miles. And so when we think about the Great Lakes region, I know I tend to think about the places where I live, where I vacation, the ones that are really special to me. In fact, this region is incredibly culturally, economically, racially, geographically diverse. And it's a huge span of geography that makes up the Great Lakes region, and of course in 2 different countries. It's the largest freshwater system in the world, and 1 in 10 Americans and 1 in 4 Canadians are actually drawing their drinking water from the Great Lakes. And as you all know, sitting here today, all of the water that you drink in Door County either comes from a Great Lake or from a place that is very much connected to a Great Lake. And of course, the ecology of the region is astounding. More than 3,500 species of plants and animals are found in the Great Lakes region. There's an incredible biodiversity despite the challenges that the Great Lakes have faced over the last 200 years. Something that we don't always think about in the environmental world is the fact that this region also supports a massive economy. If the Great Lakes, depending on what year you're doing the analysis, if the Great Lakes region were its own economy compared to the rest of the world, it would actually be number 3 or number 4 in gross domestic product. And so taken as a region, we actually have massive global import on the economic scale. And it figures into who we are as a region. The simple way I like to talk about it is that we make, we grow, and we do. These are sort of the 3 pillars of how the Great Lakes region does business. And so when we talk about making, obviously, we want to think a lot about some of the next steps that we're making as a manufacturing region, but we also know that this is the reason that the Great Lakes have such a phenomenal manufacturing legacy is because of our location next to so much clean and available and relatively cheap fresh water. So the shipping, the maritime industries, energy generation, manufacturing, agricultural processing, a lot of that came to be here in the Great Lakes region because of our proximity to fresh, clean water. Of course, we grow things. This is actually a Wisconsin picture, not from Door County. This is in Brown County, and this is actually one of the Brown County conservation staff. But agriculture is one of the largest economic sectors in almost all of the Great Lakes states. So Wisconsin advised for 1, 2, or 3 in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. Those are the 3 big ones in terms of the impacts on water. But how we grow food in the region is a massive part of who we are. It's a part of our economy, and it's a big part of what happens to our water and what's going to happen to our water in the future for the generations to come. And then, of course, we do things. This is the fun part. This is what we all like to do all summer, whether your beaches are stone or sand. We actually spend time on the water. And of course, in talking about those top 1, 2, or 3 economic sectors for those Great Lakes, for those states, tourism is actually also vying for those all the time, particularly in Wisconsin and Michigan. And so we see that people around the Great Lakes region love to get out and do things near water, whether it's a Great Lake, whether it's an inland lake. That connection is visceral, and it's very real for the communities that depend on this kind of tourism for their livelihoods. So we talk about the quality of life, the way of life here in the Great Lakes region. And I'm convinced in my work that we are very much defined in part as a region by our connection to water and connection to the Great Lakes. But the Great Lakes do face serious threats. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the biggest challenges facing the region. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the issues that may be on your mind, but I hope I'll have some time for Q&A here at the end. So if I don't mention things that you want to chat about, please feel free to bring them up. So, any guesses where that glass of water is from? It is actually Lake Erie. I heard Lake Michigan. I heard Lake Winnebago. There's probably a few other, and that's actually that's a good point. What we call harmful algal blooms, which we're going to hear about a lot more later on today, are actually a problem that's challenging the entire Great Lakes region. The big story recently, or in recent history, was what happened in Toledo almost 5 years ago now. And so that was really the example of how things can go really wrong if we don't address some of the pollution challenges facing the Great Lakes. It was the last day of vacation for me in Michigan. Got a phone call at like 6 that morning, somebody on my staff telling me, hey, Toledo's water system has just been shut down. And if you can imagine here in the here and now, in this day, this is in 2014, that an entire metropolitan area's drinking water system can be taken down because the water at the source is so contaminated that it can't be cleaned. This is the sort of thing, these are the kinds of stories people tell about 19th century Chicago when it was dumping all the sewage in the water and they turned the river around and to get all that water away from the city, because people were getting cholera and all that. This is 2014. And so we're facing today challenges to our drinking water that actually are reminding us that we haven't done a great job of protecting this water for people's use. And of course, those algae blooms lead to dead zones, not just drinking water contamination, but massive algae that blooms in the water because of the inputs of phosphorus pollution, sort of overfeeding these plants that grow in the water. And then that algae actually dies and sinks and takes all the oxygen out of the water. This picture is from also from Lake Erie. And this is not, it varies from year to year, but sites like this are not unusual. And I think we're expecting to see a significant bloom in Lake Erie this year because of the amount of rain that we've been getting that washes all of that phosphorus off of agricultural lands. And so this is going to be an ongoing challenge. The good news for Lake Erie, at least to start, is that there's been a commitment to dramatically reduce the amount of pollution going into the lake by 40% by 2025. That's a big challenge. I have some questions about whether we're going to be able to meet that challenge, but at least we have on the books a commitment to make that happen. Closer to here, we've been involved in an effort to actually get local governments to commit to measurable reductions of phosphorus pollution going into Green Bay. And so we, with a number of partners you can see here, like Fox-Wolf Watershed Alliance and UW Green Bay, have worked to convene a group of businesses, farmers, local elected officials to make commitments to actually reduce pollution going into the lower Fox River and Green Bay. And most recently, in March, there were actually 4 county executives in the Oneida Nation committed to a water quality pact that will, we hope, get them to commit to measurable reductions in phosphorus pollution going into Green Bay over the next 10 to 20 years. And we're working on getting those specific numeric commitments in place right now. So this is exciting work. It's also work that takes a very long time because we're talking about getting what's happening on individual farms and individual pollution discharges to change. Another area that I know is a big challenge and we hear a lot about is plastic pollution. About 4 years ago, we were really happy to be part of the leadership to get a national ban in place on plastic microbeads. These were something you probably read about in the news. Plastic microbeads were they're small particles of plastic that were used commonly in cosmetics and in things like scrubs and soaps. And what was happening is that we found over the first part, after about 2010 to 2014, a lot of research was starting to show massive amounts of these plastic beads showing up in wastewater and in the water in the open lakes. And so we were really glad to see that those beads actually got banned, and so they're no longer in cosmetics. But what that really was the start of a conversation about a bigger issue. A group of researchers out of New York is actually estimating that about 22 million pounds of plastic is entering the Great Lakes every year, primarily through plastic that is being washed into the system through stormwater and wastewater, and it's actually, and also through plastic fibers that are being shed from clothing. And so we actually know now that some of these plastic particles are so small that they're showing up not just in the open waters of the lakes and in the guts of fish, but they're actually showing up in processed water products. So bottled water, beer, these are particles that are so small that we're actually finding them in manufactured food products, which is really scary. And so we know that this is a long-term challenge. There's no easy fix to the plastic problem, but we're actually working through our volunteers to clean up plastic directly out of the Great Lakes, and also working to make sure that communities know what they can do to reduce the inputs of plastic to the lakes locally. Another area that I want to talk a little bit about is funding. Ultimately, when we work to protect the Great Lakes and restore the Great Lakes, that work costs money. Those investments pay off. So when we choose to invest to restore a wetland or to create wildlife habitat, or to clean up a beach or make sure that the water for swimming is actually safe for people, those projects cost money. And over the last 10 years, the federal government has invested more than $3 billion in the Great Lakes region to make sure that those projects continue, primarily through a program called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. That is a vitally important program that many people in the region have fought hard for over the years, and it's been at risk since 2016. The White House budgets since 2016 have proposed either totally eliminating this program or cutting it to the bone, and fortunately, a bipartisan coalition in Congress has said, no, that's not going to happen, and has actually restored that funding. But at this point, we're under a constant risk of seeing the federal funds that are coming to the Great Lakes for water quality protection being eliminated. And so again, the good news is that I'm not sure what's going on there, is that we've been able to continue to see that funding come into the region, and I know a lot of that's been put to good use here in Door County, but we are at a continued risk and vigilance for that to not happen. Another big issue we work on is that I know is important to many of you is the issue of invasive species. And I know we're going to also hear a lot about this at lunch today. So the big one that's in the crosshairs right now is Asian carp, bighead and silver carp. And why are we so concerned about this? I've spent more of my career than I would like to admit trying to stop invasive species from getting into the Great Lakes. The reason that these critters are so particularly concerning is that bighead and silver carp, which were brought here in the 60s through a combination of government and private sector efforts, and they escaped over the years, but most likely in the early 90s through flooding in the Mississippi River from aquaculture ponds, and actually have migrated toward the Great Lakes. The reason they're of such great concern is that these fish, they breed and they feed more efficiently than any native Great Lakes fish. So they can outcompete native Great Lakes species for food. The females can actually lay more than 1 million eggs per year in multiple cycles. And they actually have shut down parts of upper Mississippi connected rivers and lower Mississippi rivers to boating because the silver carp actually jump out of the water when they're disturbed by power boats. And so you've probably seen videos of this here and there. And it looks funny, except that the idea of going down a river in a powerboat and getting hit in the head with a 10 to 20 pound fish can actually knock you unconscious, break bones, and it has literally shut down segments of those rivers to recreational boating, which of course I don't need to tell you, for places like Wisconsin, places like Michigan, those are vitally important industries. Not to scare you too much, but Green Bay is actually extremely ideal habitat for bighead and silver carp. And so the bays, the long rivers of the Great Lakes, anywhere where you have an abundant food source, relatively shallow and somewhat warmer water, are going to be places where these fish can actually find a home. So I want to talk a little bit about what's being done to stop them. This is a map of the Chicago area waterway system. This is the river system that is the first front in preventing Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes. So right down here, this is of course Lake Michigan in Chicago. Right down here is the electrical barrier system. There's a system of barriers that has been retrofitted into this canal to try to deter the carp from moving north. And then this is Brandon Road Lock and Dam near Joliet, Illinois. And this is part of the inland waterway system that allows barges to move up and down the Mississippi River and the Illinois River and various other connected rivers on the interior of the continent. And so Brandon Road Lock and Dam is right here, a little bit south of these existing electrical barriers. And then we found live carp down below the barriers. We've also found individual live carp here close to Lake Michigan, but that does not represent an actual invasion of the Great Lakes yet. And so Brandon Road Lock and Dam is important because this is the area that is the furthest away from Lake Michigan that is actually a place where we can build to purposely control the movement of live organisms back and forth between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. And so this is actually an image of what the plan that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has put forward recently. This plan was recently issued to Congress in an official document called a Chiefs Report. And what that means is that there is now an official federal policy that is recommending to build these new protections in the Chicago waterway system and actually permanently have a system in place that is designed to stop Asian carp from getting into the Great Lakes. It's going to take about 2 years to do the engineering design on this project, and then after that it's going to take several years to build it. And so we're going to continue to be working to make sure that that happens and that we prevent that invasion of the Great Lakes from occurring. The last issue area I want to mention is water infrastructure. And when we think about water infrastructure, of course, I think about pipes. I think about big stormwater catchment basins. I think about sewers and all those things. And I think about the supply of drinking water. And I sometimes get the question, well, how is that connected to the Great Lakes? Well, a couple different ways. One is that when we think about water infrastructure, I think about the impacts that failing infrastructure has on our water. And so when pipes break, when septics go bad, when massive sewer systems that cities rely on don't work, we see discharges of pollution directly into the Great Lakes. We see people being flooded out of their homes or sewage backing up into basements. We also think about the region, as I said earlier, this is a region that's defined by our connection to clean, safe, accessible fresh water. And when people don't have the opportunity to actually access that water, that's a problem. That disconnects us. And so when we think about water infrastructure, we think about water as an entire system. Water is in the lake, water leaves the lake, it goes to people and it comes back. And that entire system needs to be clean and safe and reliable for everybody for us to really share the value of clean water across the Great Lakes. Unfortunately, we're not doing that well. We've got terrible grades on water infrastructure quality across the Great Lakes. So we have problems like sewer overflows. We have problems like failing drinking water infrastructure and lead contamination. And so we've seen over the last 4 decades a dramatic drop off. This is a graph from a coalition that I'm a part of, the Healing Our Waters Coalition. And this actually shows the severe drop-off in federal investment in water infrastructure over the last 40 years. And so it's not a surprise that we've seen these challenges get worse and worse across the Great Lakes because we're not seeing the level of investment happening that we used to. We're also seeing the costs of water infrastructure that people are paying rise over time. And this is information from a great report that I encourage you to seek out from American Public Media. And they did a story a couple of months ago on the rising water rates across the Great Lakes region. And this is a graph of several Great Lakes cities. Water rates, in the simplest terms, are rising because cities are trying to find different ways to pay for these massive infrastructure challenges. And often the only way to do that is to increase the rates that their ratepayers, their local taxpayers, are paying. And so you're seeing those rates rise and rise way beyond the level that people's incomes are rising. And so that's a big challenge to the region as well. And so ensuring access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water is going to be a key challenge for the Great Lakes region in the coming decades. It's already at our doorstep. There are communities across the Great Lakes for a variety of reasons that can't enjoy the phenomenal clean water resource that we have right here in our backyards that we could see if it wasn't so humid this morning. But I love the water. The rain is good. So what can you do? One, I'd encourage all of you to volunteer for an organization. This is a picture of one of our volunteer programs, our Adopt a Beach program, where we work to clean up beaches across the Great Lakes. However, I just suggest, get involved with a watershed organization locally. Find some way that you can put your hands to work. I know many of you probably do this already, but it's a great way to demonstrate your commitment to clean water. You can join a program like the Alliance Ambassadors program, where we train people and educate people so they can speak on behalf of the Great Lakes. We give people deep training on issues and give them the tools that they need to go to meetings and actually speak up for the Great Lakes. And then, of course, I encourage you all to act as advocates. Sometimes I know there's a lot of skepticism and cynicism about politics, and it can be daunting to call your legislator or feel like perhaps what you're saying doesn't actually matter. I can tell you I've done a lot of work with elected officials over the last 2 decades. When they get a few phone calls from one particular place asking them about a problem, they absolutely do pay attention. And so I encourage you all to take the initiative to speak to your elected officials about the issues you care about. And then the last thing I want to say is we're an independent, nonpartisan organization, and nonpartisan is not equal to being neutral. We think about safe and clean water as something that unifies. Again, as I said at the top of my talk, I have yet to talk to somebody who doesn't agree that everybody should have access to safe and clean water here in the Great Lakes. If we agree on that goal, then I'm confident we can find solutions to get there. But we can't be neutral about wanting safe and clean water for all. So I encourage everybody here to think about that. Think about, when you speak to people in your daily lives, think about expressing how important that is to you and what works for you. And with that, sorry, it's another Michigan picture, and this is why some of this work is so important to me. So thanks, everybody. I'm happy to take questions if you have time. Please.
Thank you for your presentation. One thing you didn't touch on that I realize is in some ways a narrower, this is a very broad talk. We have right across the water here a really irresponsible proposal for a sulfide mine within 200 feet of the Menominee River, sacred land of the Menominee people. And we've seen slowly over time, and back and forth through the decades, where corporate interests have taken over government agencies. And we certainly see the EPA, we're kind of struggling in Wisconsin, Michigan also with mining people, lobbyists, corporate interests running the EPA and running the DNR. And maybe you can address that a little bit about, you know, some of those issues that, what can we do to help that challenging issue, and how do we stop this really bad idea that's going to leach sulfide acid mine drainage into Green Bay for thousands of years if they decide to go forward with this.
Yep. So the question, I assume everybody heard that, but the question is about some of these challenging proposals to actually locate extractive industries in places where they're likely to cause damage to clean water. This is a challenge for Wisconsin, for Michigan, for other places as well. And then related to that, what are the regulators actually doing about this, and how, you know, what do we do? Can we rely on agencies to actually do their jobs? I think that's the bottom line, is that public agencies, so in Wisconsin, DNR, in Michigan, Department of Environmental Quality, now it's called something different, they just changed the name, and of course US EPA. So can those agencies actually be compelled to do their jobs? The answer is yes. Sometimes that means actually filing litigation and actually working through the courts to compel them to do their jobs. I will say there are serious challenges today at US EPA. There has been, in my experience, there has been an intentional disconnect created between the operations of headquarters and the operations in the regions, and with some of what we call the line staff at EPA that are out front working to implement our laws and regulations. And that is a big challenge right now. There is not a lot of, I don't think it's any secret that there has been a significant effort to pull back on regulations and enforcement under the federal EPA over the last 3 years. And so that is a big challenge. And I think there are a lot of good groups doing work nationally in the courts that are trying to address that. Locally, though, I think, you know, in answer to your question about the mining proposals is that requires great legal counsel. It requires great activism, actually going to Madison and going to Lansing and actually meeting with regulators and with legislators to make sure that the views of the community are known. And those are the tools that you've got to use in order to try to push back on those challenges. I'm happy to talk more about that. Over here.
We're in Door County. We have Kewaunee County. There's an overflow of agricultural non-point pollution going in to the waters. A recent proposal at our state legislature is to create water credits, I believe, where a farmer that's struggling can gain, because he's doing a good job or she's doing a good job, they can sell those credits to the point polluter, and there's a marketplace set up. If I'm not explaining this very well,
you're right on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's to turn this into a commodity. And my view of that is that we're selling permission to continue pollution by large systems that have large cash flows, in addition to large contaminated water flow. But it's seen as something, it's being sold to us as something that grasps both ends of the continuum and gets them participating in productive anti-pollution activities. I see it as a way to continue very harmful, large volume pollution. But somebody that maybe knows more about this than me, if you could offer an opinion about the merits of something like that.
It sounds like you know a lot, so I wouldn't assume that. So yeah, you described the approach really well. And so the thing is that there are systems that are trying to be put in place. We've worked on this for about 6 years in the Lower Fox River and in the Green Bay area. There was an attempt in 2010 to set up a system in Wisconsin that would allow that kind of approach, where you'd have, if you set it up in the right way, you could see significant reductions in pollution from agricultural lands being sold off as credits to what we call point source polluters, like sewage treatment plants. That would end up being at a lower cost for those point source polluters to actually meet their pollution reduction demands. What's missing there is actually what is the expectation of of everybody in the watershed, both agriculture and point source dischargers, to reduce over time, right? And so there's this assumption, and I think this is where it gets really challenging. This is true for Lake Erie as well. Do we just assume that we are going to have a voluntary system for agriculture and a mandatory system for cities and industries, or do we try to figure out how do we make everybody committed to protections and everybody to have some kind of mandate to actually reduce pollution over time? I know that's not a complete answer to your question, but I'm happy to talk about it more. I think that the trading system in Wisconsin is not working the way that it could, and it's not as effective as it could be. I don't think that trading, like you're talking about, is actually, I don't think that's going to solve the problem long term. I think it's a tool that we can use to try to figure out, but it's not going to solve the problem on its own.
So basically you're saying there's no metrics to see if we're making progress on this?
Particularly from the agricultural sector, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there, yeah. Yep.
You talked that the Great Lakes are all interconnected, but how about just specifically the quality of Lake Michigan compared to the others? Are we average, above average, below average? How's the quality of our lake?
Lake Michigan as a whole, so if you think about just the open waters as a whole, the Lake Michigan has very clean water. I often say to people, so I live in Chicago in the city, and we have lots of swimming beaches, and of course lots of people, and the beaches are not always clean. But I always say to people, you know, you go a mile out in Lake Michigan, you can basically, you drink the water, and it's as clean as it is, maybe cleaner than it is, you know, when it gets to your tap. So the water quality is good, but I think there are some significant risks in particular places. Like Lake Michigan has the most significant invasive species risk of any of the Great Lakes right now. It has a significant, I would say it's probably the #2 biggest challenge for harmful algal blooms and phosphorus pollution in the Great Lakes right here where we are today. And so as a whole Great Lake, the water itself is generally very good, but locally in places like Green Bay, like the Chicago area, there are some specific local challenges there that are very significant. Yes?
I heard a program on Milwaukee NPR that was talking about the levels of prescription drugs that are being found in the water now. And so I know there's, you know, a lot of talk about plastics and things like that, but there's a lot of pollutants, I believe, going on that you can't see. And I was just wondering if that's something that's getting a lot more attention. Is there anything being done to address this problem of all these drugs going into the water?
Well, yes, it's a problem. Yes, there are things being done, but I won't represent that it's something that's going to be easy or quick to solve. So when we think about drugs, we put them in a category we call emerging contaminants. And so an emerging contaminant is something that may be harmful to people, isn't regulated well, and we don't really know yet how we're going to drive down the levels. And so things like pharmaceutical byproducts would be in that category. Most of them are not regulated in the water. We think they might affect human health. We're not really sure how to solve the problem broadly. The class of contaminants that's in there, not pharmaceuticals, but that's getting a lot of attention right now, is something called PFAS, PFOA, and these are byproducts of manufacturing, primarily for non-stick treatments and other kinds of sort of chemical coatings. And that's another class of emerging contaminants that's showing up broadly in groundwater and in rivers in Michigan and Wisconsin. It's getting a lot of attention because of its potential serious health impacts on people and wildlife. And so there's some emerging large-scale cleanup efforts around that emerging contaminant that are occurring in both of those states that we'll see more and more of. And so what tends to happen is that when we get data that shows that a contaminant is of great concern to human health, that's when the action starts. Ideally, what should be happening is that the chemicals are actually screened for the potential impacts to human health before they're manufactured. And that's an approach taken in other parts of the world, like the European Union, but we don't do that here in the US. Other questions?
I believe the EPA with the PFAS issue, and correct me if I'm wrong, has been accused of dragging their feet as far as setting that maximum contaminant level. Some states are going out on their own and setting what could be considered arbitrary numbers. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree that US EPA has not been out front in setting protective drinking water quality standards for PFAS. And Michigan in particular is pushing the envelope and is actually positioning itself as a national leader in setting a protected drinking water standard. The challenge, so setting a standard is one step, and then investing in the technology that actually allows you to meet that standard is another step. And then, of course, there's a large cleanup bill with all of this that has to be addressed to actually remove some of that contamination where it's worse in groundwater sources. And so there's a whole combination of things there, but the short answer to your question is I agree that EPA's current proposals on PFAS don't actually address the health protection needs where the contamination is the most severe. We're gonna have to wrap up. Okay, thanks everybody. Talk more.